Misbehaving, The Making of Behavioral Economics by Richard H. Thaler. Picture yourself sitting in a college classroom, palms sweating as your professor hands back midterm exams. Your heart drops. 72 out of 100. Ouch. The class average? Also 72. You and your classmates march straight to the professor's office, practically fuming. This test was ridiculously unfair. Your grade point average is circling the drain. The professor, a fresh-faced young guy just starting out, nods and listens. A few weeks pass, and final exam day arrives. When you get your results this time, you're practically dancing. 96. You absolutely crushed it. But here's the twist. That 96 was out of a possible 137 points. Do the math, and you actually scored 70%. Your original 72 out of 100 was technically better, but it sure didn't feel that way, did it? This actually happened. The professor was a young Richard Thaler, and that moment, when he realized a 96 that feels amazing matters more to us than a 72 that feels terrible, regardless of what the numbers actually say, lit a spark. It was one of the first hints that the entire world of modern economics was built on a foundation that might be, well, complete nonsense. The book we're exploring today, Misbehaving, tells the story of that spark becoming a wildfire. It's about how a scrappy band of intellectual troublemakers, armed with little more than a notepad full of weird observations about human behavior, took on the academic establishment and changed how we understand ourselves. Thaler, who eventually won a Nobel Prize for all this, is our tour guide. He's charming, self-deprecating, and admits to being lazy. He only works on stuff he finds genuinely fascinating. And what he discovered? It's absolutely fascinating. It's the hidden operating system running behind every decision you make. By the time we're done here, you'll understand why you buy things on sale that you don't actually need, why you'll happily drive 20 minutes to save $10 on a cheap radio, but wouldn't dream of doing it to save $10 on an expensive TV, and why you just can't bring yourself to sell that terrible stock even though you know you should. More than that, you'll see these aren't just random quirks or personal failures. They're predictable patterns of misbehavior that reveal something profound about how the human brain actually works. This isn't just about economics. It's about you and me. It's the story of how we replaced a fantasy world, populated by perfect calculating machines, with the real world, full of beautifully, predictably irrational humans. And honestly, that's made all the difference. The story begins. Our tale kicks off in the 1970s, when economics was riding high, considered the crown jewel of the social sciences. The field had this elegant, powerful theory built around a fictional character economists called Homo economicus. Thaler gives this imaginary creature a catchier name, the econ. An econ is basically a logic robot wrapped in human skin. Econs can do complex math in their heads instantly. They never doubt themselves or get overconfident. Self-control problems? What are those? An econ would never demolish a bowl of cashews, skip the gym, or put off a project until tomorrow. When shopping for groceries, an econ flawlessly selects the exact combination of items that maximizes their happiness while staying perfectly on budget. Think Mr. Spock from Star Trek, but even more ruthlessly logical. The entire towering edifice of modern economics rested on one assumption: everyone is an econ. For a grad student like Richard Thaler, this was basically gospel. Except there was this nagging little problem. When he looked around at actual people, his friends, his professors, even himself, he didn't see any econs. He saw humans. And humans? We misbehave. Constantly. This realization didn't start with some grand theoretical breakthrough. It started with a list. Thaler began scribbling on his office blackboard every time someone violated the sacred laws of economics. These were small, everyday head-scratchers that the econ model just couldn't touch. Take his friend Jeffrey. Jeffrey had 2 free tickets to a basketball game 90 minutes away. Game day arrives, and boom, massive snowstorm. They decide it's not worth risking their lives and stay home. But then Jeffrey says something interesting. If we'd paid a fortune for those tickets, we definitely would have gone. To an econ, this is bonkers. The money's already spent. It's what economists call a sunk cost. It's gone whether you go or stay. The only rational question is watching this game worth risking a blizzard? The price you paid weeks ago is what Thaler calls a supposedly irrelevant factor, or SIF for short. But for humans, that sunk cost feels incredibly, urgently relevant. We absolutely hate feeling like we've wasted money. Here's another one. Thaler's friend Stanley spent every weekend mowing his lawn, which he despised because it triggered terrible hay fever. Thaler asked why he didn't just hire some neighborhood kid for $10. Stanley insisted it wasn't worth it. But then Thaler asked to follow up. Would you mow your neighbor's lawn for $20? Stanley looked at him like he was crazy. Of course not. Again, this makes zero sense to an econ. If $10 feels like too much to pay for lawn mowing, then $20 should definitely be enough to make you willing to do the same job for someone else. But for Stanley, and honestly for most of us, the pain of handing over $10 feels way worse than the pleasure of earning $20. The list kept growing. Friends who drive 10 minutes to save $10 on a $45 clock radio, but wouldn't drive the same distance to save $10 on a $495 television. The savings are identical, but somehow they feel completely different. One feels like a major score, the other feels like loose change. And then there's the most famous story of all, the bowl of cashews. Thaler would have people over for dinner, and while the food was cooking, he'd set out a bowl of cashews as an appetizer. His guests would start snacking. And snacking. And before long, they were on the verge of ruining their appetite for the actual meal Thaler had spent hours preparing, so he'd take the bowl away and stash it in the kitchen. And every single time, his guests thanked him. They were relieved. An econ would be completely baffled. More choices are always better than fewer choices, right? If the guests didn't want more cashews, they could simply stop eating them. Taking the bowl away removes an option. How could that possibly make anyone better off? But the humans in the room totally understood. They knew that if those cashews were sitting there, staring at them, their impulsive, in-the-moment self would absolutely demolish their patient, future-planning self. They knew they had a self-control problem. The bowl needed to disappear. So Thaler had this growing collection of weird behaviors, but no framework to make sense of it all. It was just a list of dumb stuff people do. His professors kept telling him to knock it off and focus on the rational models. But Thaler was hooked. He knew he was onto something real. The first major breakthrough came when Thaler discovered the work of two Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They weren't economists at all. They studied how the human mind actually makes judgments and decisions, and their findings were revolutionary. They argued that because our time and mental energy are limited, we don't think like supercomputers. Instead, we rely on simple mental shortcuts, or heuristics, to navigate life. These shortcuts work pretty well most of the time, but they also lead us into predictable, systematic mistakes, or biases. This was the missing piece. The mistakes humans make aren't random chaos. They're predictable patterns. Ask people whether more Americans die from homicide or suicide, and most will say homicide, because those stories dominate the news. But in reality, suicides are far more common. Our reliance on the availability heuristic, how easily examples pop into our minds, leads us straight into a predictable error. Kahneman and Tversky's work gave Thaler the framework he desperately needed. His list wasn't just random weirdness. It was a catalog of predictable biases that completely defied economic theory. Then came the second, even bigger breakthrough. Thaler got his hands on an early draft of Kahneman and Tversky's masterpiece, a paper that eventually became known as, quote, prospect theory. This paper, which later won Kahneman the Nobel Prize, became the engine powering the entire field of behavioral economics. It did this by making two radical shifts in thinking. Most importantly, it introduced this elegantly simple graph called the value function. This S-shaped curve captured three profound psychological truths about how we actually experience the world. First truth: we don't think in terms of absolute wealth. We think in terms of changes, gains and losses, relative to some reference point. If you're making $80,000 a year and suddenly get a $5,000 bonus, you don't calculate the tiny percentage increase in your lifetime wealth. You think, holy cow, what extra $5,000? It's the change from where you are now that makes you happy or miserable. Second truth: diminishing sensitivity. The difference between finding $10 and finding $20 feels enormous, but the difference between finding $1,010 and $1,020? Barely noticeable. In both cases, it's just $10, but the emotional impact fades as the total amount grows. This explains why saving $10 on a cheap radio feels like a victory, while saving $10 on an expensive TV feels like nothing worth celebrating. And the third most powerful truth: loss aversion. The value function graph showed that the pain of losing something is roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining the same thing. Losing $100 stings about twice as hard as finding $100 feels good. Suddenly, so much bizarre behavior from Thaler's list made perfect sense. Loss aversion was the key that unlocked the puzzle of the endowment effect, the idea that we value things we own way more than identical things we don't own. Thaler first noticed this with one of his professors, a wine collector named Rosette. Professor Rosette had bottles in his cellar he'd bought for $10 that were now worth over $100. He'd happily open one of these bottles for a special occasion, but he would absolutely never pay $100 to buy a similar bottle, and he also wouldn't sell any of his bottles for $100 either. This is completely illogical for an econ. The real cost of drinking that bottle isn't the $10 he paid decades ago. The actual cost, the opportunity cost, is the $100 he could get by selling it. If he's willing to give up $100 to drink it, he should be equally willing to pay $100 to buy one, but he wasn't. Loss aversion explains why. Once Professor Rosette owned the bottle, selling it would feel like a loss. And since losses hurt about twice as much as gains feel good, the pleasure of gaining $100 from selling it couldn't overcome the pain of losing his precious bottle. Same thing with Stanley and the lawn. Paying out $10 felt like a loss, while earning $20 was a gain, and in his mind, the pain just wasn't worth it. Armed with these psychological insights, Thaler started building a completely new way of looking at economics, one that put real humans, with all their quirks and flaws, front and center. He called it behavioral economics. But the old guard of traditional economists wasn't about to give up their beloved models without a fight. For years, whenever Thaler presented his findings, he faced what he called the gauntlet, a series of recurring dismissive arguments designed to defend the traditional econ model at all costs. The first argument was the as-if defense. Critics would say, sure, people aren't actually geniuses, but they behave as if they are. They'd use the analogy of an expert billiard player. The player doesn't consciously know the physics equations, but he makes shots as if he does. Thaler's response was beautifully simple. Economics is supposed to be a theory about everyone, not just the experts. Most of us don't play billiards like professionals. We play like amateurs. We don't invest like Warren Buffett. We don't cook like top chefs. A useful theory needs to describe how ordinary people actually behave, not just the rare experts. The second argument was about incentives. Critics claimed that Thaler's findings only showed up in low-stakes lab experiments. If the stakes were high enough, they insisted, people would stop making silly mistakes and get it right. The problem with this logic? It's often our highest stakes decisions, where we have the least experience. We buy milk every week, so we get pretty good at it. But how often do you choose a career, buy a house, or plan for retirement? Maybe once or twice in your entire life. We get tons of practice with low-stakes stuff and almost no practice with the decisions that matter most. The third and most powerful argument was about markets. This was the ultimate handwave. The argument went like this: even if there are some irrational idiots out there, the market will correct their mistakes. Smart money will always beat dumb money, and prices will end up being perfectly rational. The idea was that competition would discipline or eliminate anyone who misbehaved. To Thaler, this was pure faith, not fact. Markets might be ruthless, but they can't magically make you rational. If you're overconfident and start a business that crashes and burns, you might lose your shirt, but the market doesn't hand you a textbook on probability theory. To truly win the debate, Thaler knew he had to invade enemy territory, the financial markets. This was the fortress of the efficient market hypothesis, where prices were supposedly perfectly rational and beating the market was considered impossible. If he could find evidence of human misbehavior here, the entire structure of traditional economics would start crumbling. One of the first major battles was over a deceptively simple question: does the stock market overreact? Building on the psychological finding that people make forecasts that are too extreme, Thaler and his student Werner de Bont designed a simple test. They hypothesized that investors get way too excited about companies doing well and way too pessimistic about companies struggling. They created two portfolios. The winner's portfolio held stocks that had performed best over the past 3 to 5 years. The loser's portfolio contained the worst performers over the same stretch. According to the efficient market hypothesis, past performance means nothing for future results. Both portfolios should perform about the same going forward. That's not remotely what happened. Over the next 3 to 5 years, the loser's portfolio crushed the winners. The market had overreacted. The bad companies weren't nearly as doomed as everyone thought, and the good companies weren't nearly as bulletproof. It was a textbook case of regression to the mean, something any econ should understand, but that humans, caught up in dramatic narratives of success and failure, consistently forget. The defenders of efficient markets had a ready answer: the loser stocks must be riskier, and their higher returns were simply fair compensation for that extra risk. But when Thaler and de Bont measured risk using the standard financial tools, they found the opposite. The winner portfolio was actually riskier than the loser portfolio. The evidence kept piling up. But the ultimate smoking gun, the most undeniable proof that prices could be wildly, absurdly wrong, came from a bizarre episode in the year 2000, involving a company called 3Com and its wildly popular subsidiary, Palm, maker of the Palm Pilot. At the peak of the dot-com bubble, 3Com decided to spin off Palm into its own separate company. The plan was straightforward: sell a small fraction of Palm shares to the public, then, a few months later, distribute the remaining shares to existing 3Com shareholders. Specifically, for every share of 3Com you owned, you'd receive 1.5 shares of Palm. This created a ridiculously simple arithmetic test for the market. One share of 3Com must be worth more than 1.5 shares of Palm, because in addition to those Palm shares, you also kept a piece of 3Com's original, profitable business. On Palm's first trading day, the stock price rocketed to $95 per share, so what should 3Com be worth? Well, 1.5 times 95 is roughly $143. So 3Com should be worth at least $143, plus whatever value you assign to its remaining business. But that day, 3Com stock closed at just $82. Let that marinate for a second. The market was saying that 1.5 shares of Palm were worth $143, but one share of 3Com, which included those exact same 1.5 shares of Palm plus another profitable company, was worth only $82. The market was effectively valuing the original 3Com business at negative $23 billion. This was impossible. Stock prices cannot go negative. It was a blatant, headline-making violation of the most basic principle in finance, the law of one price. The market couldn't even do elementary school subtraction. And this absurdity persisted for months. Why? because the smart money that was supposed to fix these errors couldn't. To execute the arbitrage trade, they needed to borrow millions of Palm shares to sell short, but there simply weren't enough shares available. The irrationality of the idiots, desperately buying pure Palm stock, completely overwhelmed the smart money's ability to correct the price. Turns out, the price was not right. These financial battles were crucial, but Thaler and his expanding team of behavioral economists were exploring other high-stakes arenas too. They turned their attention to the National Football League draft. The NFL draft is essentially a market where teams trade valuable draft picks to select the best college players. The consensus in the league, formalized in a famous trade value chart, was that early picks, especially that coveted number 1 overall, were incredibly valuable. Teams, like the New Orleans Saints under coach Mike Ditka, would trade away their entire draft for the chance to move up and grab one supposedly franchise-changing superstar. Thaler and his co-author Cade Massey suspected this was a massive case of overreaction, fueled by a toxic cocktail of behavioral biases, overconfidence in their ability to predict talent, the winner's curse where auction winners are often the people who overvalue the prize most, and a desperate, present-focused desire to win now. They crunched years of data, analyzing the performance and salaries of every drafted player. Their findings were jaw-dropping. The market for draft picks was completely, hilariously broken. Early first-round picks commanded enormous salaries, but their actual performance, on average, didn't justify the cost. The players providing the most value, the genuine bargains, were those selected in the late first and early second rounds. The optimal strategy, year after year, was to trade down, swap your expensive high pick for multiple cheaper later picks. Yet teams almost never did it. The temptation of grabbing that one supposed superstar, the false confidence in their own scouting genius, was just too powerful. Even when Thaler and Massey presented their research directly to NFL teams, the teams often did the exact opposite of what the data recommended. The owner, they were told, wanted to win now. The research proved that even in a multi-billion-dollar industry run by supposed experts, decisions were being driven by the exact same predictable biases that affect everyone. The final testing ground for these ideas was the world of high-stakes game shows. On shows like Deal or No Deal, contestants made decisions that could win or lose them hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars. This was the ultimate response to the high-stakes objection from the gauntlet. Analyzing contestant choices on the show, Thaler and his colleagues found that prospect theory held up beautifully. People were definitely not perfectly rational probability calculators. Their decisions were powerfully shaped by their emotional journey through the game. Contestants who had a lucky streak and were ahead started taking bigger risks. They were playing with what felt like the house's money. This is a classic mental accounting error. The money is theirs, whether they won it 5 minutes ago or earned it over a lifetime. But it doesn't feel that way at all. Even more striking, contestants who had terrible luck and watched their expected winnings collapse became desperately risk-seeking. They'd turn down generous, guaranteed offers in a frantic attempt to break even and recover those large sums they felt they'd lost. One poor guy named Frank, after a brutal series of unlucky breaks, turned down a guaranteed 75,000 euros for a long-shot gamble at 500,000. He walked away with just 10 euros. The path he'd traveled mattered way more than the actual choice in front of him. Across every domain, from classrooms to stock markets to NFL war rooms, the evidence was crystal clear. We are not econs, we are humans. And our misbehavior isn't random chaos. It's systematic and predictable. This realization led Thaler to the final and most important phase of his career. If we can predict how people will misbehave, can we help them make better decisions? This question marked the shift from diagnosing problems to designing solutions. It was the birth of the idea that would become world famous as the nudge. This journey started with a straightforward problem. People don't save nearly enough for retirement. traditional economics had basically nothing useful to offer. It assumed people were already saving the optimal amount, and its only real policy tool, tweaking tax incentives, had proven surprisingly ineffective. Thaler, working with his brilliant collaborator Shlomo Benartzi, approached the problem from a behavioral angle. They asked, what are the human reasons we fail to save? First, there's inertia and procrastination. We know we should save more. We fully intend to boost our contribution rate tomorrow, but somehow tomorrow never arrives. Second, there's loss aversion. Increasing our savings rate means seeing a smaller number on our paycheck, which feels like a painful loss, and we hate losses. Third, there's present bias and self-control problems. We'd much rather have a little extra spending money today than a lot more retirement money in 30 years. With these three barriers identified, they designed a brilliantly elegant solution called Save More Tomorrow. The plan had three key features, each specifically designed to overcome one of the behavioral hurdles. First, to deal with self-control and present bias, they invited employees to commit today to increasing their savings rate in the future, often starting with their next paycheck. It's way easier to be virtuous about future you than present you. Second, to overcome loss aversion, they timed the savings increases to happen right when people got pay raises. Your contribution goes up, but because your salary also just went up, your take-home pay never actually drops. You never feel that sting of loss. Third, to harness the power of inertia for good instead of evil, once you enrolled in the plan, you stayed in it. The increases happened automatically with each raise, until you hit a preset maximum or actively chose to opt out. Inertia, which had been working against saving, was now working for it. The results were absolutely stunning. In the first company that tried the plan, employees who joined nearly quadrupled their savings rate over 4 years, jumping from an average of 3.5% to 13.6%. It was a massive success, and it worked precisely because it was designed for humans, not econs. This idea, along with another powerful nudge called automatic enrollment, where employees are automatically signed up for a savings plan unless they actively opt out, has transformed retirement savings for millions of people worldwide. These successes led Thaler and his colleague, legal scholar Cass Sunstein, to formalize their approach. They called it libertarian paternalism. The paternalism part meant they were actively trying to help people, to make them better off by their own standards. The libertarian part was absolutely crucial. They insisted on preserving freedom of choice. A nudge isn't a mandate. It's not a command. It's a gentle push in a helpful direction. It's placing fruit at eye level in the cafeteria instead of hiding it. It's painting a tiny fly image in a urinal to improve aim. It's designing a savings plan that works with our psychology instead of fighting against it. In 2010, the British government under Prime Minister David Cameron embraced this idea wholeheartedly. They created the world's first government unit dedicated to using these insights to improve public policy. Officially, it was called the Behavioral Insights Team, but everyone quickly knew it by its nickname, the Nudge Unit. One of their first projects was helping the government collect overdue taxes. Instead of sending threatening letters full of legal jargon, they tried a simple nudge. They added one truthful sentence to the reminder letters. The great majority of people in the UK pay their taxes on time. This simple appeal to social norms, the basic knowledge that most people do the right thing, dramatically increased the repayment rate, bringing in millions of pounds of revenue at virtually zero cost. The spectacular success of the Nudge Unit in the UK inspired governments worldwide, including the United States, to create their own behavioral insights teams. The revolution that began with a quirky observation about exam scoring had finally come full circle. The study of misbehavior had led to a powerful new toolkit for helping people and governments behave just a little bit better. What this all means: the story of behavioral economics, as Richard Thaler tells it, is way more than just academic history. It's a powerful lesson in how to actually see the world clearly. It's about having the courage to question assumptions everyone else accepts without thinking, and the wisdom to trust what you observe in real life over what elegant theories insist should be true. What strikes me most about this journey is its fundamental humility. Traditional economics built its grand models on a vision of human perfection, the all-knowing, all-powerful econ. Behavioral economics starts from a much more grounded and honestly more forgiving place, recognizing that we're all flawed. We procrastinate, we get emotional, we're overconfident, and we struggle with self-control. And you know what? That's completely okay. In fact, it's exactly what makes us human. The real genius of Thaler's work, and the work of collaborators like Kahneman and Tversky, isn't just cataloging these flaws. It's demonstrating that they're predictable. Our misbehavior isn't random static. It's a melody with repeating patterns. And once you can hear that melody, you can start working with it instead of constantly fighting against it. This is where the book becomes incredibly practical for everyday life. The first step is simply to observe. Watch your own misbehaviors without beating yourself up about them. Notice when sunk costs influence your decisions, sticking with a terrible movie because you paid for the ticket, or pouring more energy into a failing project. Notice when the endowment effect kicks in, that old jacket hanging in your closet you never wear but can't bring yourself to donate. Notice your mental accounts, the fun money you spend freely versus the savings you guard like a dragon. Just seeing these patterns clearly is the first crucial step toward managing them better. The second step, which Thaler emphasizes constantly, is collecting actual data. Stories are compelling, but our memories are notoriously unreliable narrators. We fall victim to hindsight bias, convincing ourselves we knew it all along. We actively seek evidence confirming what we already believe. The only real antidote is systematically tracking our decisions and their outcomes. If you're investing, write down exactly why you bought a stock. If you're starting a project, document your predictions up front. This creates a record that protects you from your own biased memory. As one of Thaler's colleagues wisely says, if you don't write it down, it doesn't exist. The third and perhaps most crucial lesson is speaking up. The entire history of behavioral economics is fundamentally a story about speaking up against powerful, entrenched orthodoxy. It's about telling the experts that their beautiful theory doesn't actually match the world outside their ivory tower windows. In our own lives, in schools, workplaces, and communities, we're often like that junior officer on a ship's bridge who sees the captain making a mistake but feels too intimidated to say anything. Creating environments where it's genuinely safe to challenge conventional wisdom, to point out that the emperor has no clothes, is one of the most valuable things any leader, or any of us, can do. Misbehaving is fundamentally a story of intellectual curiosity and rebellion, but at its core, it's a deeply optimistic book. It demonstrates that by understanding our own imperfections clearly, we can design better systems, better policies, and, honestly, better versions of ourselves. We can use our knowledge of self-control issues to create helpful commitment devices. We can harness our understanding of loss aversion to frame choices in ways that encourage better behavior. We can redirect the power of inertia to make the best choice also the easiest choice. We've journeyed through the core ideas of misbehaving today, from those first curious observations scribbled on a blackboard to government policies now affecting millions of lives. But honestly, a summary, no matter how thorough, is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. The real adventure begins when you decide to actually travel there yourself. The book is packed with stories, wit, and a profound sense of humanity that simply can't be fully captured in any summary. If any of these ideas have sparked your curiosity, if you've recognized yourself in any of these stories of misbehavior, I genuinely encourage you to grab a copy. This isn't just a book about economics. It's a field guide to the human mind, offering one of the most valuable insights imaginable. Understanding why we misbehave is the essential first step toward behaving better. And if you found this summary valuable, it would honestly mean the world to us if you'd hit that subscribe button. Here on Billionaire's Bookshelf, we dive deep into the books shaping the minds of the world's most successful people. By subscribing, you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.